Hello, everyone. I'm John Horrigan, and thank you for joining me on Journey Through the Past. In this edition, the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. This program is being brought to you by the Southborough Council on Aging. Hello to all of my friends at the Southborough Senior Center, and to all of you watching on Southborough Access Media. Folks, the views and opinions expressed are those of the author, John Horrigan, and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the Southborough Council on Aging or Southborough Access Media. Any content that I provide is of my own personal opinion and is not intended to malign any religion, ethnic group, club, organization, company, individual, or anyone or anything. If you were to ask me who are the three greatest Americans from the 20th century, I'd say Dr. Martin Luther King, Eleanor Roosevelt, and John F. Kennedy, and you can put them in any order you'd like. One of the greatest speakers and leaders of our time, Dr. Martin Luther King. Now let's look at his life. Now, Martin Luther King was born January 15, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia, to the Reverend Martin Luther King Sr., who passed in 1984, and Alberta Williams King, who passed in 1974. Now, King's legal name at birth was Michael King, and his father was also born Michael King. But the elder King changed his and his son's names following a 1934 trip to Germany to attend the Fifth Baptist World Alliance Congress in Berlin. Now, it was during this time he chose to be called Martin Luther King in honor of the German reformer Martin Luther. And King had Irish ancestry through his paternal great-grandfather, as well as African ancestry. King was a middle child between an older sister, Willie Christine King, and a younger brother, Alfred Daniel Williams. And he sang with his church choir at the 1939 Atlanta premiere of the movie Gone with the Wind. Martin liked singing and music. And his mother was an accomplished organist and choir leader, and she took him to various churches to sing. He received attention for singing, "I Want to Be More and More Like Jesus," and later became a member of the junior choir in his church. Now, King said that his father regularly whipped him until he was 15. In fact, a neighbor reported hearing the elder King telling his son, quote, he would make something out of him even if he had to beat him to death. Now, King saw his father's proud and fearless protests against segregation, such as King Sr. refusing to listen to a traffic policeman after being referred to as boy, or stalking out of a store with his son when being told by a shoe clerk that they would have to move to the rear of the store in order to be served. Now, when King was a child, he befriended a white boy whose father owned a business near his family's home. And when the boys were 6, they started school. King had to attend a school for African Americans, and the other boy went to one for whites because public schools were among the facilities segregated by state law. King lost his friend because the white child's father no longer wanted the boys to play together. Now, Martin suffered from depression throughout much of his life. In his adolescent years, he initially felt resentment against whites due to the racial humiliation that he, his family, and his neighbors often had to endure in the segregated South. At the age of 12, shortly after his maternal grandmother died, King blamed himself, and he jumped out of a second-story window, but survived. Now, King was skeptical of many of Christianity's claims. At the age of 13, he denied the bodily resurrection of Jesus during Sunday school. From this point, he stated that doubts began to spring forth unrelentingly. However, he later concluded that the Bible has many profound truths which one cannot escape, and he decided to enter the seminary. Now, growing up in Atlanta, Martin attended Booker T. Washington High School, and he became known for his public speaking ability, and he was part of the school's debate team. And he would become the youngest assistant manager of a newspaper delivery station for the Atlanta Journal in 1942, and he was only 13. Now, during his junior year, he won first prize in an oratorical contest sponsored by the Negro Elks Club in Dublin, Georgia. But returning home to Atlanta by bus, he and his teacher were ordered by the driver to stand so that white passengers could sit down. Now, King initially refused, but he complied after his teacher told him that he would be breaking the law if he did not submit. And King said that during this incident, he was the angriest I have ever been in my life. A precocious student, he skipped both the 9th and 12th grades of high school. Now, during King's junior year in high school, Morehouse College, a respected historically black college, announced that it would accept any high school juniors who could pass its entrance exam. At that time, many students had abandoned further studies to enlist in World War II. But due to this, Morehouse was eager to fill its classrooms. At the age of 15, Martin Luther King passed the exam and entered Morehouse College. The summer before his last year at Morehouse in 1947, the 18-year-old King chose to enter the ministry. He had concluded that the church offered the most assuring way to answer an inner urge to serve humanity. King's inner urge had begun developing, and he made peace with the Baptist church, as he believed he would be a rational minister with sermons that were a respectful force for ideas, even social protest. In 1948, he graduated from Morehouse with a BA degree in sociology, and he enrolled in Crozer Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania, from which he graduated in 1951. His father fully supported his decision to continue his education. While attending Crozer, King was joined by Walter McCall, a former classmate at Morehouse. And at Crozer, King was elected president of the student body. The African-American students of Crozer, for the most part, conducted their social activity on Edward Street. King became fond of the street because a classmate had an aunt who prepared collard greens for them, which they both relished. Now, King once reproved another student for keeping beer in his room, saying that they had shared responsibility as African-Americans to, quote, bear the burdens of the Negro race. For a time, he was interested in Walter Rauschenbusch's social gospel. In his third year at Morehouse, King became romantically involved with the white daughter of an immigrant German woman who worked as a cook in the school's cafeteria. The daughter had been involved with the professor prior to her relationship with Martin, and Martin planned to marry her, but friends advised against it, saying that such an interracial marriage would provoke animosity from both blacks and whites, potentially damaging his chances of ever pastoring a church in the South. King tearfully told a friend that he could not endure his mother's pain over the marriage, and he broke the relationship off 6 months later. He continued to have lingering feelings towards the woman he left. One friend was quoted as saying he never recovered. King married Coretta Scott on June 18, 1953, on the lawn of her parents' house in her hometown of Heiberger, Alabama. He was 24 and she was 26. And they had 4 children together: Yolanda King, born 1955, Martin Luther King III, born 1957, Dexter Scott King, born 1961, and Bernice King, born 1963. Now, during their marriage, King limited Coretta's role in the civil rights movement, expecting her to be a housewife and mother. At age 25 in 1954, King was called as pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. King began doctoral studies in systematic theology at Boston University, and he received his PhD degree on June 5, 1955, with a dissertation on a comparison of the conceptions of God in the thinking of Paul Tillich and Henry Nelson Wyman. Now, while pursuing doctoral studies, King worked as an assistant minister at Boston's historic 12th Baptist Church with Reverend William Hunter Hester, who was an old friend of Martin's father, and he became an important influence on King. Decades later, an academic inquiry in October of 1991 concluded that portions of his dissertation had been plagiarized and he had acted improperly. However, despite its finding, the committee said that no thought should be given to the revocation of Dr. King's doctoral degree, an action that the panel said would serve no purpose. The committee also found that the dissertation still makes an intelligent contribution to scholarship. A letter is now attached to the copy of King's dissertation, now held in the university library, noting that numerous passages were included without the appropriate quotations and citations of sources. In March of 1955, a 15-year-old schoolgirl in Montgomery, Alabama, Claudette Colvin, refused to give up her bus seat to a white man in compliance with Jim Crow laws, local regulations in the southern United States that enforced racial segregation. Now, King was on the committee from the Birmingham African American community that looked into the case, but because Colvin was pregnant and unmarried, E.D. Nixon and Clifford Durr, pictured here, decided to wait for a better case to pursue. And that came. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat.
She remained seated to stand for her civil rights. And the Montgomery bus boycott, urged and planned by Nixon and led by King, soon followed. The boycott would last for 385 days, and the situation became so tense that Martin's house was bombed. King was arrested during this campaign, which concluded with the U.S. District Court ruling in Browder versus Gale that ended racial segregation on all Montgomery public buses. King's role in the bus boycott transformed him into a national figure and the best-known spokesman of the civil rights movement. In 1957, King, Ralph Abernathy, Fred Shuttlesworth, Joseph Lowery, and other civil rights activists founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC. Now, the group was created to harness the moral authority and organizing power of Black churches to conduct nonviolent protests in the service of civil rights reform. One of the group's inspirations were the Crusades of evangelist Billy Graham, who befriended King after he attended a Graham Crusade in New York City in 1957. King led the SCLC until his death. Now, the SCLC's 1957 Prayer Pilgrimage for Freedom was the first time Martin addressed a national audience. Other civil rights leaders involved in the SCLC with King included James Bevel, Alan Johnson, Curtis W. Harris, Walter E. Fauntroy, C.T. Vivian, Andrew Young, the Freedom Singers, Charles Evers, Cleveland Robinson, Randolph Blackwell, Annie Bell Robinson Devine, Charles Kenzie Steele, Alfred Daniel Williams King, Benjamin Hooks, Aaron Henry, and Bayard Rustin. On September 20th, 1958, while signing copies of his book Stride Toward Freedom in Bloomstein's department store in Harlem, New York, King narrowly escaped death when Isola Curry, a mentally ill African-American woman who believed he was conspiring against her with communists, stabbed him in the chest with a letter opener. And after emergency surgery, King was hospitalized for several weeks, while Curry was found mentally incompetent to stand trial. Now, in 1959, he published a short book called The Measure of a Man, which contained his sermons, What is Man? And The Dimensions of a Complete Life. The sermons argued for man's need for God's love and criticized the racial injustices of Western civilization. Now, the Gandhi Society for Human Rights was a fund founded by leaders of the nonviolent civil rights movement, and King served as honorary president for the group. Quote, in the struggle for human rights and justice, Negroes will make a mistake if they become bitter and indulge in hate campaigns. Now, displeased with the pace of President John Kennedy's addressing the issue of segregation, King and the Gandhi Society produced a document in 1962 calling on the president to follow in the footsteps of Abraham Lincoln and use an executive order to deliver a blow for civil rights as a kind of second Emancipation Proclamation. The FBI, under a written directive from Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, began tapping King's telephone in the fall of 1963. Concerned that allegations of communists in the SCLC, if made public, would derail the administration's civil rights initiatives, Kennedy warned King to discontinue the suspect associations and later felt compelled to issue the directive authorizing the FBI to wiretap King and other SCLC leaders. This man, I always cringe when I see his photo. J. Edgar Hoover feared that communists were trying to infiltrate the civil rights movement. But when no such evidence emerged, the Bureau used the incidental details caught on tape over the next 5 years in attempts to force King out of the preeminent leadership position. Blackmail. Now, King believed that the organized nonviolent protest against the system of Southern segregation known as Jim Crow laws would lead to extensive media coverage of the struggle for Black equality and voting rights. Now, journalistic accounts and televised footage of the daily deprivation and indignities suffered by Southern Blacks and of segregationist violence and harassment of civil rights workers and marchers produced a wave of sympathetic public opinion that convinced the majority of Americans that the civil rights movement was the most important issue in American politics in the early 1960s. King organized and led marches for Blacks' rights to vote, desegregation, labor rights, and other basic civil rights. Most of these rights were successfully enacted into the law of the United States, with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, passed by the administration of Lyndon Johnson, but the foundations were formed by the Kennedy administration. Now, King and the SCLC put into practice many of the principles of the Christian left and applied the tactics of nonviolent protest with great success by strategically choosing the method of protest and the places in which protests were carried out. There were often dramatic standoffs with segregationist authorities, and sometimes these confrontations turned violent. Throughout his participation in the civil rights movement, King was criticized by many groups, which included opposition by more militant blacks, such as Nation of Islam member Malcolm X, separatist Stokely Carmichael, and Omali Yeshitela. The Albany Movement was a desegregation coalition formed in Albany, Georgia in November of 1961, and a month later, the SCLC became involved. The movement mobilized thousands of citizens for a broad front, nonviolent attack on every aspect of segregation within the city, and it attracted nationwide attention. Now, when King first visited on December 15, 1961, he had, quote, planned to stay a day or so and return home after giving counsel. The following day, however, December 16th, he was swept up in a mass arrest of peaceful demonstrators, and he declined bail until the city made concessions. According to Martin, that agreement was dishonored and violated by the city after he left the town. King returned in July of 1962, and he was sentenced to 45 days in jail or a $178 fine. But he chose jail. And 3 days into his sentence, Police Chief Laurie Pritchett discreetly arranged for King's fine to be paid and ordered his release. Quote, Martin said, we had witnessed persons being kicked off lunch counter stools, ejected from churches, and thrown into jail. But for the first time, we witnessed being kicked out of jail. It was later acknowledged by the King Center that Billy Graham was the one who bailed King out of jail during this time. Now, after nearly a year of intense activism with few tangible results, the movement began to deteriorate. King requested a halt to all demonstrations and a day of penance to promote nonviolence and maintain the moral high ground. Divisions within the black community and the canny, low-key response by local governments defeated efforts. Though the Albany effort proved a key lesson in tactics for King and the national civil rights movement, the national media was highly critical of King's role in the defeat and the SCLC's lack of results. After Albany, King sought to choose engagements for the SCLC in which he could control the circumstances rather than entering into pre-existing situations. In April of 1963, the SCLC began a campaign against racial segregation and economic injustice in Birmingham, Alabama. The campaign used nonviolent but intentionally confrontational tactics, and black people in Birmingham, organizing with the SCLC, occupied public spaces with marches and sit-ins, openly violating laws that they considered unjust. Now, King's intent was to provoke mass arrests and create a situation so crises-packed that it will inevitably open the door to negotiation. However, the campaign's early volunteers did not succeed in shutting down the city or in drawing media attention to the police's actions. The SCLC changed the course of the campaign then by recruiting children and young adults to join in the demonstrations. Newsweek would call this strategy a children's crusade. Now, during the protests, the Birmingham Police Department, led by this man, Eugene Bull Connor, used high-pressure water jets and police dogs against protesters, including children. Footage of the police response was broadcast on national television news and dominated the nation's attention, shocking many white Americans and consolidating black Americans behind the movement. Not all of the demonstrators were peaceful, despite the avowed intentions of the SCLC. In some cases, bystanders attacked the police, who responded with brute force. King and the SCLC were criticized for putting children in harm's way, but the campaign was a success. Connor lost his job, the Jim Crow signs came down, and public places became more open to blacks as King's reputation improved immensely. King was arrested and jailed early in the campaign, his 13th arrest out of what would become 29. From his cell, he composed the now famous Letter from Birmingham Jail, which responded to calls on the movement to pursue legal channels for social change. King argued that the crisis of racism was too urgent and the current system was too entrenched. Quote, "We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed."